Hello, my name is Donna Williams. I'm going to talk a little bit about low-cost and no-cost strategies for communication disorders. My background is I've been an autism consultant since 1996, and I've worked with over 1,000 families of kids with autism in that time. I am also a qualified teacher, and my own background is I was diagnosed as a psychotic child at the age of 2 in 1965, and later with language processing disorder, and my autism diagnosis was confirmed in my 20s, by which time we didn't just describe psychotic children as autistic, we just called them autistic. I gained functional speech in late childhood, and my own communication challenges were not one particular challenge, they were a collection of challenges that came together. One of the main issues that I had was I was meaning deaf. So I had verbal agnosia, the inability to put meaning to incoming language. And what that meant was that when people talked in long, winding strings, I couldn't break this down into the one word, one meaning system. So one of the strategies that was used to help me to come to be able to understand language was people talking much more slowly, in bullet points, in telegraphic speech, and using a lot of gesture so that I could see what they were talking about, using representational objects to juggle different concepts in relation to each other. Because I was unable to do that inside my head, I had to externally mentalize. I had to do it all outside of my head. And so if you wanted to say to me, Donna, come on, we're going to the shops, you would say, Donna, us, shops, going, now, come on. So it's much more bullet point, it's much more telegraphic. You might say, Donna, I want you to put your shoes on, and then we're going down the street. So you would say, Donna, the shoes, yours, where? So then I'd go and get the shoes. Maybe you would say, okay, shoes on, feet, now. And then, okay, number 1, shoes. Number 2, going out down the street, so that I've got a sense of the sequence. So we can spend a lot of time trying to speed people's processing up by doing all kinds of things to their bodies, but actually we can also speed up their processing by making things much easier for people to process quickly. Another interesting thing with language processing disorder is that if you cut down on a lot of the background noises, fans or machine noises in the background, it's much easier to process speech for a lot of people. Another one is I was quite meaning blind, so I saw my world in bits. I couldn't see a face as a whole, so I saw, the eyelashes, lost the eyes, got the nostrils, lost the nose, got the face, lost the body, got the person, lost the room. And because of this, it was very hard for me to understand what people were talking about. So they had to physically link everything for me. So if you were trying to teach me language, you'd have to teach me physically. If you wanted me to understand the clock, you'd have to help me to feel the movement of the clock. If you wanted me to understand the scissors, I'd have to feel the movement of the scissors. If you wanted me to understand a ruler, I'd have to physically have that experience, because there wasn't the natural translation between the visual and the verbal. Now, as I came to try to, I was echolalic, which is very common for children with language processing disorder. And this meant I spoke in pattern and theme and feel. So instead of saying, oh, I see, that's the vitamins, they're good for me, I did a TV advert, Palmolive, mild, more than mild on your hands as you do dishes, you're soaking in it, dishwashing liquid, it's Palmolive. And if you listen to the advert, what the theme is, there's a general feeling of reassurance, and her friend is sort of saying, don't worry, this will be good for you. So I used this statement to mean that theme, and people with echolalia commonly will do that. They'll take a certain phrase, a certain song or advertising, a piece of advertising, and they'll use it as a very set type of meaning. If you want them to use conventional speech, instead of cancelling out their existing language, what you do is you learn the dictionary, you map out the dictionary of what those phrases mean in their world, and then you link it to the other words. The same can be done with what's called idiosyncratic speech. So I had the word for cat was whoosh, 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 which was also my word for hair, whoosh, and velvet, whoosh. But of course, if you said the word cat, it sounded very arbitrary, it didn't mean anything. But you could, and I also had brook, brook meant cat, because as these legs would come past, they go brook, brook, and if you pat it, it goes whoosh, whoosh. So I had whoosh and brook, but no word cat. If you could teach me, a picture, cat, and the word cat, and then I would see a real cat, and it would be brook, whoosh. So how my father bridged these was he would say, it's a Bruckenstein fush cat, Bruckenstein cat, fush cat. And so I kept hearing this cat as if it was a suffix on the end of my own idiosyncratic speech. And so this got me patterned and used to understanding this word in a real life context. And then eventually I accepted it as interchangeable with my own idiosyncratic speech. I developed selective mutism, where I found myself unable to speak loudly enough or clearly enough for anyone else to hear. And we often see people with autism who have oral dyspraxia, very poor pronunciation. But if you are extremely socially anxious and quite naturally solitary, you will keep your speech to yourself and you'll mutter it rather than speak it clearly. Or you'll talk in your own space rather than direct your speech at somebody. And with selective mutism, you can have times where the person will go progressively more silent. And what my father used was singing. So he would sing speech and he would do it in a way that didn't feel invasive. So he would do it out loud to himself as though he was entertaining himself in his own world. And this is what I call an indirectly confrontational approach. So if you think about cats and dogs, an approach with a dog is very directly confrontational. Here, boy, come on. If you think about the approach with a cat, it's play hard to get, small doses, leave them wanting, and then they will chase you. But with selective mutism, or with involuntary utterances that come out predominantly in situations of social anxiety or overstimulation, the more that you use an indirectly confrontational approach, the more that this person gets a grip on their communication. So with selective mutism, the more that you fixate on the person, the harder it is for them to dare communicate. With exposure anxiety, you can get involuntary avoidance, diversion, retaliation responses. So they will either have selective mutism or say a whole lot of things they don't mean to say, or say the opposite to what they mean. And yet, if you use a less socially invasive approach and you use a more, if you like, oblique approach, if you become less dog, more cat, what happens is that these people stop self-protecting so persistently and get closer to their own communication. Also, the quieter you are, the louder that they will start to dare to be. And if you're talking down a tube rather than directly, it looks more like play than the seriousness and social invasiveness of, oh, I'm expecting you to communicate with me. Also, if you were insisting on eye contact and you think of that in a context of social anxiety, you're actually stifling communication for very socially anxious people. So sometimes you have to put the goal of eye contact off to the side in order to free up that communication and get people to step into clearer pronunciation and get them experimenting more with speech than they would if you were looking directly at them. This is also especially important when you're talking about people who can't see you as a whole, because the more that you get them to look at you, the more that they may feel quite seasick with all the bits of you that are coming at them. And if they use their peripheral vision, they may tend to see you more as a whole. So don't get overly fixated on the eye contact thing. It can be overrated depending on what the issues are that are going on for a person with autism. One of the other really important communication strategies is augmented communication. And this is what you're going to do for people with speech aphasia or such severe oral dyspraxia that there's no way these people can be verbally, that you can comprehend their verbal speech. And although a lot of people use electronic devices like iPads or, laptops for augmented communication, there's no reason why you can't use a letterboard, and it's essentially just a piece of cardboard with all of the keyboard letters that you would normally have on a computer, on a keyboard, but also with your yes and your no and I don't know. And basically the person can point out what it is that they want to say. There's often this idea that if the person can't speak, then how could they possibly read? Now, if you go to the supermarket and you're used to the name of that supermarket and you see the trolleys, you know that that word is, that supermarket. You can get used to brands. There's a whole lot of ways that people acquire an ability to recognize a word without formally having good reading skills. And I was meaning deaf, but I could read. And although I could read, I couldn't come up with my own communication. I could read by rote. But when I was about 9 and I was beginning to understand language and starting to construct one word, one meaning sentences, I was left with a typewriter. And so I began to type letter strings, pob, bob, pob, bob, 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 bob. And I recognized the words within there and I said it in my mouth, and I realized that I could type words that I could say. So I started listing words that I knew, cat, and typing them out. And then I realized that any word I could remember I could type. And so I began to write word lists. And then I found that the words triggered different feelings in me, and I found that quite interesting. So I made lists of words that created different kinds of feelings. And several years later, I was able to type poetry. And nobody would ever have imagined that someone with such a degree of incomprehension, who even couldn't read with meaning, could nevertheless learn to type. And this, I hope, gives you belief in a good reason to keep an open mind, presume competence. It costs nothing to do this. And there's no reason why you can't start with letterboard. Many people who have access to electronic devices still use letterboards when they go to visit someone's house, or if you know, their batteries are flat in their device, or they can't afford a device. And also some people will need facilitation in doing this. This doesn't mean that it's you're convinced that this is the light and the way. Facilitation is part of a process of helping a person to overcome their involuntary avoidance, diversion, retaliation responses in their communication, for example, or things like OCD or Tourette's affecting the communication. And if you're using facilitated communication, your goal is to then begin fading that support out to the point where you're just perhaps, you know, touching their shoulder and they're doing the communication. And there are so many people on the internet now who have come through facilitated communication that's been progressively faded to the point where they're now independent typers. And I think people have to realize it takes time for the identity to adjust to the fact that it really is their own communication. It takes time for identities to adjust to this idea that they are empowered, and that this doesn't mean their carers are all going to abandon them, etc. So there's a lot of anxiety in becoming an independent communicator. And I think that we shouldn't believe that everybody is instantly ready to be that. Some people will take considerable time getting control of their impulses and having progressive confidence in their ability to use independent communication. And just because it takes time doesn't mean that we should deny those people the right to a letterboard. Okay, I also feel that gestural signing is important. I do use some Auslan, but I also use fluent gestural signing. And so if I wanted to talk about you people over there in South Africa, and maybe I want to talk about that we were getting together and we're going to read a book, and the book was about lions going up trees. You know, I think that the ability to use gestural signing is valid. It doesn't have to be Makaton. It doesn't have to be Auslan. One of the things about gestural signing is it's really transportable. It helps to augment poorly pronounced speech. It gives people in the street an ability to understand you to a degree without having to learn a specialized language or get specialized training. And also, gestural signing is much quicker to comprehend than something like Makaton. So, for example, in Makaton, this is apple, and in a very literal mind, this is I squeeze my cheek, and this is apple. So that's an example of the difference, if you like, between the speed with which one can more easily process gestural signing and the extra time it takes to go back and retrieve and remember a symbolic sign, you know, such as some of the signs in Makaton. So don't underestimate the value of using gestural signing as augmented communication. And I hope that's been useful in giving a little bit of an overview of some of the low cost and no cost strategies for building communication. Okay, thank you.